Now entering the Bitcoin Podcast Network.
Today's episode is brought to you by KeepKey, the easy, safe, and simple way to protect your Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and many other digital assets. There's no time like the present to protect yourself from hackers, malware, and viruses. Visit keepkey.com to order your secure hardware wallet today and use the code HUMANIST10 for a limited time 10% discount. And before I begin today's episode, a quick life update. I'm currently writing a book, which is exciting. It's about our exponential and fragile context and how crypto can help us smooth the transition through this digital revolution. So I'm not sure on the title yet, but I'll be posting updates through Medium and on Twitter. So check me out there, and hoping to have it done by the end of this year. So I'll let you know also through the podcast when that happens. Cool. So let's get to today's episode. Okay, hello everyone. So in today's episode, I chat with Liv Boeree, who's a really good poker player, and she's also a rationalist and effective altruist. And we chat about a lot in today's episode. We talk about her charity to get rich poker players to give back money. We talk about thinking about how to do best in the world and existential risk versus stuff like factory farming. We talk about consequentialism from a philosophical level. We also talk about taking her poker playing mindset and applying it to crypto. And we also talk about the power of thinking and probabilities. So it's a pretty jam-packed episode, and I want to kind of pull off two philosophical things that we chat about around consequentialism. So, and as a reminder, consequentialism is it's a moral framework to judge your actions, and it's a very kind of outcome-based mindset, kind of a utilitarian and ends-based mindset. It's what a lot of effective altruists use. And you say, hey, okay, let's judge this action based off of the impact it created on the world. And it's different than something like virtue ethics or deontology, which is more of a means-based mindset, where you say, okay, you should abide by a set of virtues like honesty or whatever. So those are kind of the two different things, essentially the classic ends versus means argument. And it's weird because so I asked Liv about what does she not like about consequentialism, and the thing that's powerful about consequentialism is that, and this kind of weird concept to get, it's what we would call what I would call meta right, or it's anti-fragile, or wins from the process level. And what I mean by that is, when you talk with a consequentialist, there are kind of two pieces of this. So when you talk with a consequentialist, the weird thing is they're always happy to be proven wrong. They're always kind of searching. They're just searching for the truth, and not to be right. So they're happy when they update their beliefs and things like that. And so really you're kind of working with them on the process level. They're very much like, ooh, tell me how I'm wrong and how can I change? And so it's tough to beat a thing that has been designed from the start to love it when it is being told it's wrong, and then to change as a result. Kind of a piece of that is and a key piece at the kind of bottom of this is that, and this is something that I recently wrote about in the book, is it's hard to break consequentialism, at least at a first glance. I'm not really sure here, and it's because when people try to break it, you say, hey, well, that's, you're talking about this thing, and it's very outcome based, and it's actually bad in this specific scenario because you should have used, virtue ethics over here, or, that's a situation that really requires honesty or whatever. And you're like, okay, that's interesting. In that situation, how are you judging good or bad in that situation? And when you ask people that question and keep asking that question, they usually judge good or bad based off of the outcomes that it creates. Or oh, it's bad over here because it created a bad outcome. You're like, oh, well, that's pretty much consequentialist. And so this is to say, in other words, when people object to consequentialism, they often do so by claiming bad consequences. And so this is this weird kind of process level meta property that consequentialism has, where it can answer most objections to it by turning them into consequences. Or in other words, it's powerful because it can take the objections, turn it into consequence, and thereby subsuming those kind of objections into its own worldview. So that's kind of a weird concept, but I think it's mostly correct, or at least factorially correct. And the weird piece with it too is that if you kind of connect it to some of the stuff that's happening today with the intellectual dark web, so there's a group of people, I haven't chatted about them too much on the show yet, but it's kind of fascinating, weird group of people who are, in theory, these kind of rationalist public intellectuals like Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and I don't want to go into their claims right now, and they all have different claims. They're all very different people, and there's lots of texture there, but I want to talk about how they operate at the meta level and at kind of the process conversational level. And as an example here, Brett Weinstein was moderating a debate between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and he opened in theory, this debate with something where he said, hey, so let's have each of you give the strongest version of the other's argument. So they were essentially doing a steel manning of it, where they said, hey, make sure that you can give the best version of the other person's argument, the version that they would super agree with, and then let's move on from there. And so that, just as a process, that seems great, and the process level seems right. Their actual claims, again, that's a totally different subject, but I think that we should feel free to say yes when people are doing good process level work. So this I'll say, I'm excited to have folks on my show later who are going to push back on consequentialism more, and then we'll kind of be able to turn this kind of binary gradient into a synthesis where we understand the power of virtue ethics as well. So that's one piece here. The other piece is, another kind of fascinating part about consequentialism is, and something that Liv talked about, is you couldn't really do consequentialism back in the day, and it's kind of it's a data-driven kind of moral framework, and it would have been tough to do that pre-science, pre-enlightenment. So at that time, it made sense to do more of a religion-driven, kind of symbol-driven. Remember, because people couldn't, there were many more illiterate people. It made sense to have that kind of virtue ethic moral framework back then, instead of a consequentialist framework. But now, it's possible to have consequentialism as a moral framework, and Liv was making these claims about how, as we go forward into the future with more data and big data and all these things, it'll increase our ability to do consequentialist work. And I, whether or not I agree with that or not, I kind of want to take a step back and say, this from a high level, when we think about these macro transitions that occur, and when I'm talking about these macro transitions, I'm talking about like agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, information revolution, these big shifts in how information and capital flow and how power work. And when you think about the kind of macro systemic level, these kind of dominant macro institutions that exist, these are nation states, religious institutions, firms, markets, how people coordinate together, those dominant institutions, they compete with each other, they co-evolve with each other, they change. For example, as the Industrial Revolution happened, there was a decrease in the power of the church and an increase in the power of the nation state. And that, those dominant institutions, not only do they operate off of, capital and violence and things of that variety, but they also operate with myths that try to match their reality. And these are kind of stories that reinforce the dominant institution. And this is kind of what Liv is getting at, is that, a key part of the myth is this moral framework that's based around it, and the value set that's based around it. And so back in the day, if consequentialism wasn't really possible as a moral framework, given the fact that, given the dominant, the dominant institution at the time and the way that, we understood information at the time, that happened back in the day, and it has now shifted. So too should we expect our moral frameworks to change, based off of these the shift in dominant institutions, based off this information revolution. So if right now we have certain dominant institutions with certain myths around them, as we continue to propagate through this information revolution, what are the myths? How are the myths going to change, and how are the moral frameworks going to change? So as a specific question here, kind of a weird example, what moral framework should be associated with like a meme as an institution? That's kind of gets you where my mind is going here. And this is all part of this kind of macro piece here, where as we go forward into the future, we've had this really good, and this is kind of Daniel Schmachtenberger stuff, where we've had a good version of is and ought, and the is piece is science. Science is a great process to determine what is true in the world. But ought, what should we do? What is good in the world? That's more difficult, and we don't have a good process for that yet. And the issue is that as science has done such a good job, it's given us so much more power. It's given us distributed exponential technology, but it hasn't given us the responsibility with that. And so what is our current theory of choice today? Well, right now, our dominant theory of choice is this kind of monetarily based game theory, and that won't work long term. As we've seen with many of our existential risks, game theory is the kind of generator function for them, and we need a better theory of choice than game theory. And in fact, we don't just need a better theory of choice, we need a process, a scientific method-style process for determining that theory of choice. So this I'll say, the question here is, what does a scientific method look like when you apply it to morality and ethics? So with that, sorry to wax philosophical a bit, but I really did enjoy this episode with Liv, and we talked about those things and many others, and hope you enjoy it. Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark, and you're listening to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future. And in this podcast, we take a systems thinking approach to doing good in the world. We have a couple different series that focus on different system scopes. And today we're going to focus on both Series A macro systems, where we ask the question, where are we as humanity headed? And we'll talk a little bit about Series B human systems, where we ask the question, how can we as humans be more effective? And to talk about both those things, I'm very happy to introduce Liv Boeree to the show. Liv is, among other things, like astrophysics, Liv is interested in many things, and astrophysics. She's a professional poker player. She's a champion in both the European Poker Tour and the World Series of Poker. She has more than $3.5 million in tournament winnings, and she's also the co-founder of REG-Charity, a fundraising collective of poker stars that has raised over $6.5 million for cost-effective charities through donating a percentage of their winnings. So, Liv, thanks for being on the show, and welcome.
Thanks so much. Nice to be here.
Excited to chat. And I think so. Let's just start at kind of a high level here. And could you explain what REG-Charity is to our listeners?
Sure. So REG-Charity, REG stands for Raising for Effective Giving, which is, I guess, a pun on the word raising and nice. Poker. And what it effectively is a fundraising organization that encourages poker players, not just poker players, people within the poker industry and beyond it, anyone who's sort of a professional who, makes money and thinks about donating, and encourages them to donate to a very, very carefully selected handful of charities and nonprofits. We started in 2014. It was me and 3 other poker players and some sort of full-time philosophers and philanthropists who sort of got the idea going. And after basically I learned sort of about the idea of effective giving, effective altruism, sort of applying rationality and logic and reason to the philanthropy space. I was like, this makes a lot of sense. And the idea was we think poker players will also get this, being as they're people who sort of think about sort of cost effectiveness and accounting for cognitive biases and these kind of things in their decision making. You can sort of apply that same mental framework to sort of your charitable giving.
Got it. Yeah, I like that. So you're essentially hitting up rich poker players for money.
Pretty much, yeah.
Saying, yo, let's give some money. What has that been like in terms of, and I'm thinking about, like, if you have these people who have made this money, what has your experience been thus far in terms of reaching out to them and being like, look, you probably have enough, you could like give some back, and also there's these super effective ways to give it. What has that process been like as it's kind of spread in the community?
Usually, to be fair, like with a lot of poker players, I think particularly the more successful ones, they realize sort of how much of a charmed life they live. Don't get me wrong, like it can be a lot of hard work to grind poker professionally, but at the same time, you have a lot of freedom over not only of your own sort of finances, but of your own time. You definitely, I think you get the impression that you've been quite fortunate to get to where you've gotten to. And so I think a lot of these players realize this, and therefore they have a sort of sense of like, well, I can help out there. I think we've seen what it's like to be on the end of good and bad luck. And so they can see, they can take a look at the world and go, there's a lot of people who've just been a lot less lucky than me. There's a lot of bad luck out there. And I think they feel, sort of sense of duty to help others. It's not usually that hard of a discussion to sort of point out to people, look, will you miss 5%? You've just won $1 million. Will you miss 5% of it? They're usually like, no, why? The act of giving in itself can make you feel good, and they, because they know that it can be done in a very well measured, cost effective way. It's usually not that much of a hard sell to certainly to the more rationally minded poker players.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. So a couple points on that. The one is the act of giving good, of just giving feels good. I felt that too. I don't have very much money, but I recently gave some percentage of my wealth, just $3,000 to charity, and one of the ones was giving $360 to give directly, and you can essentially support someone's basic income for $30 a month. So I essentially gave someone a universal a basic income for a year, and the studies just show, hey, this just gives you a long-term mindset. It releases you from your scarcity mindset, and it's just like, it feels good. It's like, why that I'm not missing that $360 and giving it, just saying those words, you can hear the enthusiasm in my voice. I'm pumped about it. So I think that's true, which is sweet. I think the other funny piece that you're getting at is that for poker players, and we'll talk about crypto folks in a bit, but like just the pure act of like thinking about, if I do have money, how can I most effectively give it? Doing that kind of problem solving is fun for people, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, if you like numbers, if you like sort of planning out sort of your decisions, it's like managing a portfolio when you're making, like, deciding which altcoins to buy. In the same way, you can go, okay, well, I want to give away X percentage this year of my income. How do I want to distribute it? I mean, you're not going to usually just sort of stick your finger in the air and sort of see which way the wind blows and decide which coins you buy. You sort of research and think, look at what is the most promising. Well, you can do the same thing with figuring out which problems you think are most important in the world, sort of like which are the biggest cause areas that we should be prioritized first. And then within those, which are the which charities or which organizations are actually making the most headway, which have the most promise. It's sort of like this, there's I imagine quite a lot of crossover. I mean, I'm certainly not a trader by any means. I've got a passing interest in crypto, particularly when it was buying so well last year. But yeah, there's sort of there's a lot of similarity in the way that you would sort of analyze which coins you would buy to which charities you would want to donate to in order to sort of have the biggest positive impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. So for you personally, thinking about this, spreading it within the poker world, is it, for you, let's ask for you personally, when you have, you've made a good amount of money in poker, and honestly, some of the people that I chat about with some of the crypto people that I have on the podcast also have a lot of money. When you have that much money, I guess, how do you think about it? Do you feel like you're on a hedonic treadmill sometimes and you like get yourself a nice car, or do you feel like you, when you're like, self-taxing yourself and giving it to charities or whatever, do you like, what stuff has been the most painful, I guess, tell me about your own experience with giving.
Not sure that anything, I mean, as in like, what has been, is there like an amount that I find too painful to give, you mean? I'm
just looking for texture on. So for me as a person, I don't know what it's like to, I pretty much am a person who goes in the world and hits up richer people for money and says, look, we live in a world of abundance. Yeah, you should give more money back. And you as a person who actually has money, what is that? Tell me what that experience is like to actively take significant amounts of money, and give it back. When is it painful? When is it not painful? Yeah. That's kind of
well, so it's with something like poker, where it's your income is so unknown. That's a sort of difficult range of emotions to deal with. Where like the original model we started out with Reg was saying, okay, well, how about you sign up to give somewhere between 2% and 5% each quarter? So it's like a regular thing. But a lot of poker players eventually sort of shied away from that because they were like, look, my income, I don't know, I can go 2-3 quarters in a row with losing, or not making as much profit as I'd hoped, and then maybe have like a big windfall in one quarter. And so I think the irregularity of the income can make it very difficult. And it's the same. It's very easy to sort of find justifications to not give as much as you originally planned to, even after you've won, because you're like, well, I know I got lucky, to have won as much as I just did this in the last few months. So I don't want to, I want to, I make sure I have enough of a nest egg. But I think it's, you have to sort of keep an eye out for these sort of signs in yourself where you're looking for like bad justifications to essentially sort of weasel away out of whatever commitment you had said to yourself at the beginning of the year. Like my partner, he's been very strict on. He's like, after learning about effective altruism, he's like, I want to give away 10% of my income each year without fail. And to be fair to him, he is someone who is able to just completely detach himself from, if he has a losing year, so he'll just shrug his shoulders and be like, okay, well, I had a losing year. And so I don't know. I mean, a percentage is a percentage, right? But at the same time, like I've had times where I feel more bad now, where I've had like a bad few months or a bad year, and so I can't give as much. I give the same percentage, but it's not as much, and then I just feel bad. Like, well, actually, maybe is this? What am I going to do with this extra 20K? Like, I know that it's going to directly save around 3 lives. So by not giving it, I'm making, am I effectively killing 3 people? Like, there's all these kind of moral dilemmas that you run into. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's, there is a balance to be struck, and it really does depend on the individual. But I mean, my advice is always just, if in doubt, sort of like look at the numbers, and go realistically, okay, what is the amount that I can survive on per month? Okay, it's X. What is the amount that I will be, that's a bare minimum. What's the amount that I will actually be very, very comfortable on? And then find some number in between. And yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, I think we should all be giving far more than what we currently are. But at the same time, if it causes us more distress than it gives us joy, that's not good either. And you've got to think about sort of future earn as well. It might be
I think there's a difference between this win-win thing that you're talking about. Is really funny, actually. When we're going through the world and we're like, oh man, making money. And for me right now, like my rule is after I make more than $4,000 a month, aka and at that point you have essentially more money doesn't make you happier. After about $4,000 a month, then after that I give 50% back to various effective charities. And it's been funny for me to learn about that feeling that you're talking about, where I personally feel weird about, like, I want to get above that $4,000 number, not just for me, but because I want to give more, so that's the kind of funny thing that you're talking about. And I think that the other thing you talk about, which is producing ranges, is really powerful, where you say, what is the least needs version? What is the super comfortable version? And then for people to just try to, as Lao Tzu said, be the person in the room with the least needs and try to vector towards that lower number. It seems powerful.
Yeah, that seems like the objective, ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of zooming out back to the kind of effective altruism more generally, could you tell me a little bit more about the kinds of causes that you are most interested in? Because there's lots of different, there's the existential risk ones, there's kind of current world developing health ones, there's kind of the meta ones like promoting effective altruism or institutionalized decision making. So which ones are you interested in?
I think the one that sort of is on my mind the most is the sort of global catastrophic risk, as existential risk stuff. And that's, in all honesty, largely for selfish reasons, because that's the thing that sort of directly affects me the most likely, out of many of these things. So yeah, in terms of like, where do I currently donate to? Those are the areas that basically these extremely neglected cause areas that are surrounding many global catastrophic risks. There's ones like climate change, which actually, pretty much everyone's aware of, and there's a lot of people sort of working on the topic. But then there's stuff like biorisk from the sort of increasing likelihood that, someone with a postgrad in, even an undergrad in biology in a few years' time might be able to genetically engineer some funky new virus. Yeah. And like all these like emerging techs that are appearing that actually have these risks that aren't really being thought about. And so there's more and more sort of these little tiny sort of risk of massively impactful disasters building up over time that need a lot more of the world's smartest minds working on. So there's this sort of bottleneck, not only in funding, but also in then, the ability to get these, to get the smartest minds away from actually working on building the technology as fast as possible to working on, okay, how do we build the technology in also the safest way possible? Because, safety is not as sexy as actually just building the things. Being the person that does it. So like that's sort of the area that I guess I'm most interested in. And then in terms of like what I was like sort of am I emotionally most invested in is honestly, I've always been just a huge animal lover, animals and the environment and so on. And the sort of daily holocaust that is going on in the animal world with factory farming, deeply upsets me. Just the more I learn about it, the worse it gets. So it's like I never find a piece of information I'm like, oh, well, okay, that makes it a little bit not so bad. No, it's just the more I learn, the worse it really is. And so I'm very interested in sort of anything that's sort of trying to make the conditions for the animals living on these in these really bad factory farms just a little bit better, reducing the numbers that we're incessantly breeding. And in the long run, technology that could hopefully replace it, such as clean meat and so on. So those are the sort of the two main areas I'm focused on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that and this is, so the funny thing with something like effective altruism and just trying to do good in general is, and this gets at what the different cause areas that you're talking about, is like when you say, okay, we want to do good, the question becomes, well, for who, on what time scale? And when we ask that question, well, if we're talking about the first piece there, the kind of existential risks, well, then the time scale gets like pushed into what they call like humanity's cosmic endowment, which means not only people alive today, but all the people who are alive in the future. And if we like accidentally mess it up, and like studies show it's like, 10% chance or whatever of humanity going extinct by the end of the century or whatever, then not only it was sad for the people today, but it was also super sad for the, millions, billions, trillions of people that would live, way into the future. So that's kind of the weird long-term future mindset. And then the other one, which is also super powerful, is what you say for who on what timeline. And if you say, well, who is not just humans, it's not just people in the Western world or people in the general world. It's also people. It's also animals. And like you say, when you think about that, you're like, oh man. And the thing that I learned the other day, which was surprising, is it's like tens of billions of land animals are factory farmed every year. And then I learned it was like about 1 trillion fish every year. And again, fish, not as much connection there and questions about consciousness or whatever, but like that kind of minds. I was like, wow, that is a lot of fish that are killed every year.
Right. You can sort of do, a sort of an expected value calculation to an extent, sure, even with something like, even if you think that a fish has very little moral weight, you think they're exceptionally dumb and maybe they only feel maybe 100th the pain of something like a pig or a dog. Still, if there's 1 trillion of them, you do the math.
It adds up fast.
It still adds up to a lot of moral weight, and like that's really like the sort of best framework we have for thinking about these things. Although actually I heard again like another dark thought surrounding sort of this animal suffering idea is actually that you could make an argument that the less sort of neurons, or the smaller the brain, the more basic the brain, the more evolutionarily important the sensation of pain is to that animal for survival. It's less able to reason and think and make smart decisions outside of like pain stimulus. And so actually the experience of like a fish having its fin chopped off might be many orders of magnitude worse than the experience for us having our arm cut off, because actually like we can sort of we don't need so much pain stimulus in order to know that we shouldn't get our arm cut off, whereas a fish might like really need that. So there's that dark little mind experiment to go down as well. But anyway, so I mean, but nonetheless, like like with all these things, that you can, if you think it's very low moral weight, you just still have to like multiply it by the numbers. And in some cases, particularly with like animal factory farming, the numbers are just like so huge. Something like 70 billion animals are killed a year, like land animals are killed a year. that wouldn't have otherwise been, and they're like generally not killed in good ways. And it's not like they had a happy life before that. So it's pretty rough.
Yeah, so I agree with the roughness. Let's kind of take a step back to the long-term future stuff for a second and say you just wrote a piece for Vox on the Fermi Paradox. Could you tell us a bit, and because this kind of makes talking about more dark things, this might make it darker in terms of our humanity and existential risk or whatever. So tell us about that article.
Sure. So basically, it was built off or based on a paper that the Future of Humanity Institute, which is like a research sort of think tank in the University of Oxford, they just published this paper that did renewed analysis on the Drake equation, which is the sort of very famously bad equation that is used to try and estimate the likelihood of other intelligent civilizations being around in the galaxy, aliens essentially. And before, whenever people had tried to plug numbers into this Drake equation, it would come out with an extremely high expected number of intelligent civilizations that we should be able to detect. And so this sort of creates the illusion of a paradox, because it's like, well, okay, so sure, there are like so many stars and planets, even in our galaxy alone. The universe is so old. Why aren't we getting all these signals? This number that we keep getting out of the Drake equation is so high, but we're not seeing any evidence. Like, what the hell's going on? And basically, the Oxford folks did a far more accurate method of analyzing the sort of the state of our current state of knowledge across like the factors within the Drake equation. And when you do that, and then you also apply like Bayesian update, like some evidence, updating with the evidence and the fact that we're not seeing any observations so far. You put all that together, and it comes out that we're roughly somewhere between. I'm trying to remember the percentages, but definitely like above 75% to be the only intelligent civilization in our galaxy, and in fact around a 50-50 chance being the only intelligent civilization within the entire observable universe, which is pretty much the most groundbreaking thing I could ever imagine I would ever read. So much so that I was like, there needs to be an article written about this. Like, this paper is amazing. And also that there's a lot of moral weight then to that. That raises a lot of philosophical questions. Like, okay, if it turns out to be true, then what does this mean for us in terms of sort of like, is there extra moral weight on us not to go extinct? Yes or no? And so that's kind of what it was about.
Yeah, that's tough because it's like, because you can have the mindset of like, oh, well, we tried our best, and like it turns out that like the artificial superintelligence did end up killing us, but it's fine because there's other conscious life in the universe, and so we feel fine about it. But like this is like, well, we might be the only ones, so like let's not screw it up.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, if the universe does have wants and desires, which that's out to the jury, but it would be pretty pissed, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
exactly.
These stupid humans, like when blew up their planet. Like, what the hell? It took me 13 billion years to like make that happen, and now like it's now done and gone. And and so basically, like what I should like clarify is that this the paper isn't like making the statement this is how we are alone in the universe. It's just saying, based upon the current state of sort of astrobiological knowledge, if you do the statistical analysis properly, which in the past it had not been done, basically this is what comes out of the Drake equation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If and when we do find more information, perhaps we'll find out that we might understand how life actually really got started on Earth, because right now we still don't really know. If we get some more clues there, or we find, of course, if we see signs of actually an intelligent civilization somewhere else in the galaxy, well, that's going to massively shift the sort of the numbers we have, the ranges of uncertainty. But yeah, I mean, as of now, our best information is to go ahead assuming that we are pretty much alone. I think that strengthens the moral case that we should get our shit together and not blow ourselves up.
Yeah. So do you think, does this stuff make you, and you kind of made this distinction earlier between the long-term future and then kind of like the emotional kind of animal stuff. Does this, when you think about us and I think a lot of people, and some of my friends who work in effective altruism and the kind of modern day existential risks and stuff like that, they get they get stressed around these things. Well, how do you, once you start thinking about these things and think about the percentage that we might all die, or whatever, do you get stressed? What is your like emotional response to this kind of stuff?
Oh, it's everything. I'll go from abject terror to a sort of, not impartial, but just sort of shrugging my shoulders and going, well, what I'll tend to do is I'll go, when I'm in the sort of like fully in the grips of terror, thinking about it, then I'll be like very much sort of deep in the research and working, thinking about ways to sort of reduce the risks in the ways that I think I can maybe have some tiny amount of impact. But then when I'm in my other sort of emotional state about it, where I'm just like, maybe this is never going to be solved, and we don't have, the possibility space that we'll actually get it right is it's too unlikely in all the spaces of ways it can go wrong. So when I'm in this really despondent state, then I'll just be like, okay, I need to be focusing on how do I just make however many years we have left, or life on Earth has left, a little bit less bad, a bit more pleasant. And so then I'll be thinking more about like reducing the factory farming problem. So, those are my two like main states. And I mean, I'm not saying that's like, that I'm either in one or the other and I have nothing else in between. I'm also very, very good at compartmentalizing it. Nice. And, just being like, getting on with,
brushing your teeth or
brushing my teeth and, stressing about, I haven't paid my car insurance or something, something mundane. I don't know. I wouldn't say that my brain is particularly set on one. I wouldn't even want to hazard a percentage of how often I'm in one emotional state or the other, but it's generally a mixed bag and it's often quite stressful. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, I think the thing that you talked about there is essentially the main strategy that I use, which is bucketing things into the things I can control and the things I can't control thing, where it's like, look, so like we were born at this point in time, we're trying to do our best, we learned about these things, now we're trying to use them to do our best, and like if it all goes to shit or whatever, that's okay, then it did, but we tried, and there's some that feeling of trying feels good. I think that it would be sad state if the effective altruist community learned enough about our current status quo that they were like, well, we're screwed enough such that we should only concentrate on the people alive today. That would be like a bad indicator. Cryptocurrency is vibrant and exciting, but it's not without its share of bad actors. Exchanges and personal accounts can get hacked, computers can be infected with malware. Left unprotected, your digital wealth is up for grabs. Don't let yourself be a victim. KeepKey is the safest and simplest way to protect your Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and other tokenized assets. This hardware wallet is a separate device that you control. Brought to you by the pioneering team at Shapeshift, KeepKey works with the wallet software on your computer to manage your private keys and transactions. Your device is PIN protected, which provides protection if it falls into the wrong hands. Its large display lets you carefully view and approve every transaction. And if your KeepKey is ever lost or stolen, you can safely recover your device without compromising its private keys. The bottom line, you'll sleep easier knowing that your digital wealth is safe and secure. Visit keepkey.com to order yours today and use the code HUMANIST10 for a limited time 10% discount. So with that kind of mindset, let's talk about like pushing back on effective altruism. It's interesting, Vox, you just wrote a piece for Vox. I know Vox is starting to do they're going to do a big deep dive into effective altruism, which will be cool.
Yeah.
What for you personally though, what are your issues with effective altruism, with consequentialism, with this kind of world?
I mean, I can't say I have like any like strong issues with the actual philosophy itself, because I think, if there was something that I felt that the philosophy was doing wrong, it would be something pretty obvious, and so they would be doing it already. To say, that they're doing that wrong would imply that I have a greater knowledge than it, and I definitely don't, than the sum of all the people currently working on it. But I mean, it might sound a bit silly, but the reason why I'm such a big fan of the EA philosophy is that it's all about like being very good at updating and like genuinely changing your mind in the face of new evidence. Like the people I've gotten to know in it, what I find so astonishing is that they're genuinely happy when they find out that they were wrong about something. They're like, oh, cool. Nice. I can update my model and it's more accurately, an accurate model of what reality is. Yeah. There's very little like attachment to sort of, I guess, like egoic attachment to the belief of being right. And like, that's something that I personally struggle with. I think most of us do. And I mean, I'm sure they also individually do as well. But like as a whole, like I've never met a group of people who are better at being like that, and it's a goal I definitely aspire to. But I think it does. I think it can and does struggle with sometimes. It's like just sort of the image or the perception that people outside of the movement sometimes have of it, because they're like, oh, it's about saying that some charities are bad and some charities are good, and like it's like. People get like, can understandably get quite sort of defensive about that, particularly if they've been particularly focused on a particular cause area, which, then isn't like perhaps included under the umbrella of effective altruism. I can understand why that can create sort of a negative sentiment. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's an area that it maybe needs to work on in general, just sort of its perception. And I mean, it's always going to be a tricky thing where you're sort of trying to say, look, we should try and keep emotions out of our decision making around philanthropy as much as possible, when at the same time, like, philanthropy is ultimately driven by emotions. What humans' a desire to go and help someone, to do good, to help an animal out of a trap or something. Those are driven by an emotional response, and it makes me sad when like the sort of the image that people have is like, oh, these effective altruists, they're all these like emotionless coals people who just think purely in numbers. It's like no, it's like no one is like that, and it's about learning to sort of combine the head and the heart together. So I think that's probably maybe like an area that just needs to be mindful. Like the community could be mindful of, is just like how to make sure that point gets across. And I think I think it's generally doing a good job, but it's a tricky sort of area to navigate.
Yeah. So generally, you're pretty you not too much. I do agree with you to say that when people are correct about their process, then it's hard for them to be. Then you can claim incorrect on some small things in it, but then they're just like, oh, am I incorrect? Well, tell me why. And you're like, oh, sweet. Well, then now you've changed. So being meta right or having a correct process is really nice. And an example of that within the EA community is this thing called double crux, I think, and it's where a conversation style where you, instead of trying to win the debate, you're actively the entire time you're essentially just pushing forward what you see as the weakest part of your argument and how you could be changed on it, and trying to see if the other person can do so. And that's what each side is trying to do. And you kind of like win by pushing out the best parts and then talking about the best attack vectors on those parts and then having the other person change it. So it's kind of, a weird mindset around like trying to pushing win.
Out. Yeah. You mean like, it's like the opposite of debating, basically, where it's you're trying to straw man your own argument instead of you're steel manning the other person, trying to look for the strongest parts in theirs and looking for the weakest parts in yours, because actually the goal is to come to the objective truth, not just win exactly. For winning's sake. Yeah.
I think on the note of effective altruists are just into like, earning to give, like going and working in Wall Street and just like giving that money to good, or like, this charity's right and this charity's wrong or whatever. I think that, I like the mindset, or I like talking about effective altruism and this is true, as a group of people who are just based around trying to answer the question, how can we do the most good? And then when you have it as a question, then it kind of can be a little bit less aggressive, and they've thought a lot about it, so it can get aggressive. But so I guess, do you think, a little bit pushback on this, do you feel like consequentialism, aka an outcomes mindset, aka utilitarianism, aka ends over means, do you feel like the ends always justify the means?
I never want to say anything with 100% certainty, but I've found the more and more I've learned and applied it to my life, the more sort of I'm finding it really hard to pick holes in it. And I honestly learning like the difference between sort of a consequentialist mindset as opposed to a deontological, rules-based mindset. When I learned that, a friend of mine like who's a philosophy major, just like drew it on the back of a napkin one time at dinner. It was like the most light bulb moment I've ever had. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are for sure like situations where it's not optimal. I think like the thing is like, as you know, in the past we had like when there was very little sort of actual understanding of how the world worked. You know, in the Middle Ages, we didn't really know. You know, we didn't know what temperature was. We didn't know how. We didn't even have like basic science. You know, the scientific process, anything like that. You know, we didn't understand how a society could work together. People had to live by these like draconian fixed rules that, you know, whether they believed they were passed down from God or whatever, like, because that was really the only way to make things work. Like there was no room for granularity or nuance. But as our understanding of the way the world works, you know, of like having actual data to sort of see what causes things, what is cause and effect, and so on. As we've like gotten more and more into this like data-driven world, that's allowed the room for more like consequentialist decision making. Yep. We don't need these like rules that are very sort of, in some ways, myopic and black and white and simple. We've enabled room for more granularity. And I mean, in like 100 years' time, assuming everything goes right, we're going to have even more like understanding of, you know, I don't think we'll ever have like Laplace's demon style like prediction abilities and so on. But still, you know, like as progress, you know, as technology and scientific understanding and just like computation increases, we'll be able to move more and more to like consequentialist reasoning and morality effectively. So I think as a rule of thumb, I think that's the trend we'll be going, pardon the pun, using a rule of thumb, but you know, that's the trend we'll be going more towards. And I think it is a more optimum one than it feels to me like living rules based is kind of just going backwards. Mm-hmm. But that said, there are still definitely instances where we need it in order to function still right now.
Yeah. I think that you're correct in saying that consequentialism can kind of come into its moment now. I think one argument could say that it is it might lose some of its power in the future as the world becomes more fast and complex, and if we aren't able to kind of keep up with that. And this is kind of like a Taleb anti-fragility, long tail risk, black swan argument that says, hey, if the consequentialist can't actually put a probabilistic chance on a certain like X risk thing happening in the future, then maybe then maybe we can't have that mindset. So I think that's moderately powerful. I do agree with you though that like consequentialism, the crazy thing with it is that it can kind of beat you from a process level where you say, wait, well, I think that in this situation, it was bad for me I should have a virtue ethics or a deontology or a means mindset here because in this situation, it was very powerful. And you say, well, why do you think it was powerful? And then people always end up talking in terms of the impacts and the outcomes. And you're like, well, you're essentially consequentialism.
So you're being yeah. I mean, either way, I think it's extremely important to have flexibility in the way you approach things. And like there are definitely situations like that's a perfect example with these black swan type tail risk things where at present consequentialism is not necessarily the best way of approaching it. I mean, that said though, I mean you're still, you know, you can still do an approximated expected value calculation on these things. And so you're still ultimately looking at the impact as your guide of whether or not something, you know, of how to make a decision. So I know it all feels to me like it all still ultimately boils down to that, but I could well be wrong.
Yeah. Sweet. So yeah, generally speaking, effective altruism, good. So let's kind of let's talk a little bit about crypto for a second, just because there's some there's some overlap in terms of REG-Charity, in terms of like the REG-Charity folks and like getting, you know, the people in, getting the rich people in crypto to kind of give. And then there's also overlap just in terms of like a interesting kind of crypto kind of games mindset, poker games mindset. So I'm just curious, how are you currently thinking about the cryptocurrency world from a poker player perspective?
I mean, the most meaningful takeaway I've had from it. So, you know, I'd had a bit of Bitcoin since, 2015, a very small amount. Mm-hmm. And then when things started really kicking off sort of around April of last year, I started getting a bit more involved. And that worked out pretty well. But what's interesting is sort of, I know, in poker, you learn very quickly that just because you're winning over a period of time, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're making good decisions, that your strategies are sound. We often see like very, very bad poker players going on, winning a big tournament that beating 1,000 people and believing that then they're the best, or conversely, it can go the other way around. Like basically results and outcomes aren't, they're correlated, but they're not very strongly correlated to skill, especially over the short term. And, with what I can imagine a lot of people who got involved with crypto, around summer of last year, they probably came away thinking, well, I'm the best at this. I chose such good coins and like, look how much money I've made. But, it's very easy to feel like the best decision maker in the world when you're just in a bull market where even the worst players are also winning. Yeah. So I guess that's like the biggest sort of parallel that I can draw between.
I think that's super powerful, and it's, I guess, resulting is the term that poker players use, where you say, hey, blah 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 happened, and I won or I lost. And it's like, wait, you shouldn't think about the win or the lose. You should think about the mindset and process that you took in order to get to that thing. And I think that a lot of, in the crypto world, it's like,
done that decision 1,000 times. How does that turn out? Not just that one time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the funny thing with crypto is you have, some people are just, and as you talk about, like, okay, you got it in April. Well, it's good you got it in April and not, 5 months later or something, and so there's kind of, and was that really an indicator of your intellect and your ability to, do signal to noise within the internet or whatever? Maybe, and maybe not.
It was my ability to surround myself with people who have their finger on the pulse better than me, and more smarter than me on these kind of things. And just when I hear like a critical mass of them all talking about it, I was like, well, I guess I'll get involved a bit more heavily. No, it was just more a case of good fortune.
Well, I think that kind of process, I think that the takeaway there would be, hey, for you personally, it was a thing where you said, hey, when there's enough of a mass of my friends talking about it, these smart friends talking about it, it is likely to be the case that this thing is worth some value in some ways, and look, I can invest in it, and therefore I will, and then the resulting mindset would say, okay, in this case it actually went up, though it could have gone down just as well. You could have had that initial indicator of lots of friends talking about it without the thing actually going up in the future. The other thing that's tough here is like thinking about, as you say, like when everything's going up, everything's going up. So the other perspective that one could have here is kind of a first principles perspective around like how to value these currencies. And that's a whole other thing in and of itself, where you say, okay, what should the actual value of these various currencies be? Because they have different kinds of valuation methodologies and whatever. And that's all hard too. Another question I have for you, though, in this crypto land / games land is, so a lot of people, when they talk about cryptocurrency stuff, there's this idea of mechanism design, where you essentially do reverse game theory, where you say, I want to get this outcome, and how can I create a system that will create that outcome? Right. And so you're essentially using incentives to get there. And I think that that's a very similar mindset, and people in the crypto world talk about, lots of them are like ex-game designers or ex-game players in various ways. I think that poker definitely has some of that too. So I guess, I'm not really sure what my question is here, but like, what kind of games do you like, or how do you think about games? Have you ever made your own games, board games, whatever?
Yeah, I'm generally pretty obsessed with games, mostly just because I'm just so ridiculously competitive. I need a way to like scratch that itch. So like, I'm currently I have a big chess addiction. Like, it's an actual problem. I just play it online on these like live games you can play online, and it's bad. Like there's like the 30-minute games where it's like nice and deep, and you can actually think and really deeply strategize and improve your chess, and then it goes all the way down to like 10-minute, 5-minute, and now as I just discovered 1-minute games, which is literally just like you're barely thinking, you're just like it's who can move the pieces fastest, and it's like crack, not to equate drugs to chess, but that's like that's what it is for me. It's a bad situation that I do when I'm like a little bit stressed. I'm like, I'm going to play some 1-minute blitz chess, but I love it. So that's like a particular game that I'm very into. Another really fun one is Hive, which is kind of like, and just, my boyfriend Igor and I, we discovered it recently, and it's very fun. It's kind of like chess-like, but you build the board yourself. And if someone's into chess, I think they would really, really enjoy this game. It's called Hive.
Cool. I was just saying, I want to check out Hive. Have you heard of Ricochet Robots, by the way?
No, tell me about it.
It's good. It's really good. It is a game where you have a bunch of... There's a board, and you have all these 5 little robots on the board, and you're trying to get the robots to go from their positions to like these goal positions. But the way you have to move them, it's kind of like they're on ice. So when you kind of like do a move, they move until they hit a wall or they hit another robot.
Okay, so like inertia.
So they like kind of bounce around. And what happens, the way a game works, is like it happens in rounds. And at the beginning, you flip up a goal that a certain robot is trying to go to, and then everybody just looks at the board and tries to, count out a path essentially for that robot to the goal and say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It bounces around. Okay, and then I would say 7 because I see like a 7 move bounce to get the robot there. I say 7. I start the timer, and then other people try to get ones beneath 7. And I have found it has a very high correlation between people who are into chess, poker, computer science stuff, and loving Ricochet Robots. So I'll send you a link afterwards. But
it sounds like the dream. Thank you for finding my new method of wasting my life away.
Exactly. Nice. So kind of maybe in this final kind of bucket here, moving away from crypto and games, one thing I just want to do is to try this. I mean, so there's this book called Thinking in Bets. There's this, you gave a TED Talk recently called A Number Speaks 1,000 Words. And these are all things from poker players' mindsets where you say, hey, I think in numbers all the time, and I apply that to the poker world, but I can also apply that to the real world and think probabilistically in the real world. So I guess, what are the ways in your life that you kind of apply probabilistic thinking in like to non-poker situations in your own life?
I mean, in all honesty, like I try to build the habit of, whether I'm like trying to make a decision about, am I gonna be on time? How am I gonna make this flight? Instead of sort of thinking to myself, I'll probably make it. I'll actually try and put some granularity on that, because the word probably is extremely large. Like, I don't even know what I mean when I say it to myself. So yeah, I found myself usually just putting some kind of range, percentage range on, and any kind of prediction that I'm having to make, whether it's literally, will I make it on time for dinner? Is it going to rain? I mean, is it going to rain tonight is a classic one, but, like really just having like that, trying to put a degree of granularity to which I'm comfortable on these decisions. An example I actually like to talk about is, I even do it in my love life. Like my partner, actually, we were trying to decide, are we going to move? Should I sell my property and should we move somewhere else, move to another country? And we were like, these are major decisions. Mm-hmm. And so we were like, what do we think the likelihood is that we'll still be together in 3 years' time? Like, well, that's a good, and we both thought about it quite critically, and both came up with and wrote, and we're like, okay, actually let's do our 1 year and 10 year predictions as well. Screw it. And so, we both wrote them down independently on a piece of paper and then showed them to each other. And luckily we were pretty much
intense.
But, and of course it takes a high degree of comfort and security, I think, to be able to sort of do that with one another. But at the same time, we're both so trained in thinking in probabilities, and we know how valuable it is. Even if I'd come to the conclusion where I was like, actually, I think the number's only 50% or 30%. Even if I didn't have the guts to actually write that down, that would have been information to myself to be like, shit, maybe I'm not as confident in this as I thought I was. And so, yeah, there are these sort of things that we hold kind of sacred that we don't feel comfortable trying to estimate in a quantitative way, or even estimate at all. Like that, or the strength of a feeling that we have about someone, or I think my friend is pissed at me. How confident am I in that? People are like, I just feel it. I don't know. No, I mean, put a degree of confidence on it, 20%, 80%, whatever. And yeah, so it's definitely a skill that is very developable. Like,
yes.
the more you get into the habit of it, the more it seems alien to not think in numbers in that way.
Yeah.
And are you the same?
I'm the same. I'm definitely the same. And I think, and just for the listeners, I mean, it's a great thing, as you say, to take any kind of word that implies uncertainty, whether it's probably or maybe or unlikely or whatever, and just try to put a number for it. And a funny thing that I'd like to ask you is so once you, at the beginning, you start doing it and just say, there's probably like a 70% chance this happens or whatever. Later, though, you start to add your error bars to it, where you say, okay, there's like a 50 to 90% chance that this happens or whatever. Do you find yourself are you error barring now as well?
Because when I make my estimation of 70%, unless I have like an immense amount of back data of like a specific situation before, my uncertainty is going to be pretty wide. So I've found it's more accurate, particularly when relaying information to someone else, to give them a range, because A, it doesn't imply a sort of false degree of confidence, but B, it also sort of checks in with myself. So it's if I say, I'm certainly going to be there, what do I mean by certainly? That's somewhere usually between like 90 to 99%.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually made like a chart that I put in my TED talk that's of these like commonly used words of estimation, and like it was like, with the little corresponding bars of which probabilities they should, or at least I think they should apply to. Yep. But if there's a really fun chart somewhere out there. I think if you I'll try. You can put it in the podcast notes. Where they actually polled a bunch of people. What do you think the word probably means?
Yeah.
And like there were literally numbers from everywhere from 20% to 95%.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't mean anything basically when you use it. And like something like maybe literally means nothing. It could be anything from 0 to 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And yet people use it all the time, perhaps intentionally to like give themselves wiggle room. But these words are bad in general. And I think it's much better if we just speak in numbers.
Yeah. We hope for a future society in which honestly, it would be nice if everybody used these kinds of error bars. And I think that the great thing with you giving a probability and giving the error bars is so nice. And sometimes my friends will make fun of me for it. We'll say, look, I don't know, I think it's probably, but 20 to 80% that this happens. They're like, that's a huge, that gives me no information. You're like, look, I'm giving you information by telling you that it's such a big range.
But I'm letting you know that I'm also uncertain.
Yeah, it's like
that with the will. The point is, it's the truth.
I know it's annoying for you, but yeah.
You want me to sugarcoat it and say, yeah, for sure? No, that's not good either.
Exactly. The other funny thing is when I've taught English at various points in time in my past, and when trying to teach them about these words, and they're like, well, what is the difference between like maybe and possibly? And I'm like, I don't really know. We're pretty much out of time today, Liv. Thank you for chatting about REG-Charity and effective altruism and long-term risk and vegetarianism and also thinking in bets and crypto. And I guess for someone to learn about you on the interwebs, where should they go? Like your Twitter profile?
My Twitter. I have a website as well, though I'm not very good at updating it. Yeah, Twitter is usually the best thing.
Twitter handle?
It's just my name, /Liv _Boeree.
Boeree. Yep.
Yeah, that's the one.
Nice. Check Liv out there. And if you want to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Okay, thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.